Hello and welcome to Unwatchables. I'm Marc Dottavio.
I'm Seth Troyer.
And this is kind of an unusual episode for us. So far, even the most problematic films that we've talked about haven't really been actively immoral or arguing for something that is clearly flat out evil in a way that really crosses the line. And I think that's where The Birth of a Nation comes in. This is the 1915 film by D.W. Griffith, and we did have several discussions about how or whether we even should discuss this movie. So I just want to put our intentions up front. If you have any interests in cinema history, at some point you're going to cross paths with The Birth of a Nation. At the time, it was the most expensive film ever made, it was the longest film ever made, and it was seen by more people than almost any other movie. And on top of that, just in terms of its formal qualities, it brought together all of these innovations of the silent film era into maybe the first feature-length movie that really looks like what we consider to be movies today. So just on a technical level, nothing had ever been achieved on this scale. It was the first film screened in the White House. It was screened for the Supreme Court. And if you do check it out today, you'll see there are quotes from the current president, Woodrow Wilson, throughout it. So it was ubiquitous. Now, that being said, most people today just haven't seen this movie. So it has not had the enduring popularity of something like Gone with the Wind, where you can kind of put a disclaimer at the beginning and just mentally adjust for the conventions of the time period. This movie, it's all on the surface. It is about its ideology. So you can't really apologize for it. You can't redeem it. And I think you can't ignore it. Whether you actually sit through this movie is a personal choice, but I do think that there's value in grappling with it because there's a lot to understand about its place in American culture and what made it such a powerful piece of propaganda. So I don't think that it's doing a service to all and any of the people who suffered because of the ideas that this movie helped propagate to pretend like it doesn't exist. The truth is, and it may be the most provocative thing here, is that great art can be used for evil. And these ideas at one point were embraced by mainstream society. Now, on the other hand, it's also important to remember this was a controversial film at the time. So even though it was popular, it was widely criticized, it was banned in some places, and plenty of people called it out for exactly what it was back in 1915. So what I'm interested is what the experience of actually watching this movie is like now in 2022 and what it would have been like at the time and just what it can tell us about our own cultural history and the power of film. So sorry for the long-winded introduction there. I do want to give Seth a chance to chime in here because this was your first time actually sitting through The Birth of a Nation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Put this one off indefinitely until a certain podcast came along. I think it would probably take most people a podcast or a class or something like that to get them to actually like sit through this in any sort of way, unless they're a fucking Klan member or something. Which let's jump for me. I think, and maybe I'm wrong, I think it's just really good and pertinent to just right there. Let's work. Let's say why this is just a quick summary. Like what is the ethos at the center of this that is so disturbing about this? Before we even, I would like to get into that even before we get into like anything that would tantalize a viewer as far as like what the story is, what the film conventions it invented is. I would like, yeah. So, I mean, basically this does come from a sometimes inconsistent view, but it does seem to come from a Southern perspective of seeing the North as, like, first of all, the North as instigators in the Civil War, of like this being like their idea. which of course is like not historically accurate. And it's like super vague about like why that even happens or what the deal even is. It portrays Southern life and slavery as being like, you know, just rosy colored glasses, and like all the slaves who are portrayed, many of which are disturbingly portrayed in blackface, are seen to be enjoying themselves and being friendly with their masters and dancing and like loving Southern life, like a lot of the time here.
And the masters are kind to them. They get
Yes.
along. This is an idyllic paradise that's about to be overtaken by the Union.
Yeah, it's like a science fiction movie at the beginning. Like this first little part of this movie before the war starts feels like a science fiction movie because of how like much this is a delusion that we're seeing. Uh, but it's being portrayed as reality of like this southern world being this beautiful wonderland that we lost, you know, after things got so twisted after the war and stuff. Which, again, to advance forward, it perpetuates that the after the war, the Ku Klux Klan are sort of not villains but saviors of an old way of living, of this old utopia for white people. Um, and that whole last hour is notorious and extremely intense to witness the idea of like the Ku Klux Klan being seen as victorious saviors coming in at the end, and like we are supposed to be applauding or something, which of course any sensible audience member does not. If anything, probably would turn it off at this point if you haven't already.
Yeah, and that's basically what this movie is. It's a historical, and this is in giant air quotes, historical epic tracing the beginning of the Civil War, through Lincoln's assassination, and through Reconstruction. And it is completely revisionist history. I mentioned Gone with the Wind because that is still a very beloved movie, and it engages in a lot of the same pre-Civil War idealizing that we see here. It's a little bit easier to get past in that movie because that's not necessarily its top agenda. It is about a character, and it gets a little further away from the historical stuff the longer that it goes on. But that shows you exactly where they're coming from here. That's this whole idea of the lost cause of the Confederacy, that actually things were great and everybody was happy until the North decided that they were going to take over these states and exploit them and punish them. And that afterwards, Reconstruction was a huge disaster that had to be taken back again by the whites. And this whole movie is basically a Southern guy getting to sit down and say, this is how it actually happened. This is the reason for all of this violence with the KKK. It all makes sense. It's all justified. And there's definitely an absolute agenda that this movie is trying to push. So I think a good place to start would be to talk about a guy, a real piece of work named Thomas Dixon Jr. He is the author of the book that The Birth of a Nation was based on and the popular play, which is an adaptation of the book, and that's called The Klansmen. So that it tells you right there where he's coming from. This is a guy who grew up in North Carolina during the Reconstruction period. He was a son of a slave owner and a Klan member. Not him, but his father was. And his uncle was actually the head of his Klan chapter. So that was a very like romanticized figure in his life. This guy actually met Woodrow Wilson in university together. So they did become friendly at some point before either of them rose to national prominence.
Not a good look.
And no, definitely not.
And
And we will definitely.
am I wrong that the film itself was originally titled The Klansman, almost like up to its release? Like it was released for like I found something like that it was released for a little while under The Klansman.
Yeah, it was originally called The Klansmen. I'm not sure exactly at what point they changed the title.
Hmm.
Uh,
Pretty early into
but
the release, but yeah, if
mm,
anything, let that know that going into seeing this movie is like, and then that's how I walked away and was like viewing the movie anymore. Like, was like, okay, Birth of a Nation, if you want to call it that, but really what we're looking at here is a movie that feels very much like it's called The Klansman, and it is, yeah.
that would be a much more truthful title than the whole like propaganda sounding Birth of a Nation, because
Yeah,
you come to this for a history lesson, you're not going to get an accurate one.
and it really speaks to the
But yeah, this
perspective that's going on here that's kind of inconsistent. It almost feels like for a second there, he's like being, they're trying to be honest about what this is, which is like, it's a Southern perspective, very like Ku Klux Klan, like oriented, like uh, white nationalism kind of stuff. And then they're like pulling it back for a second, like maybe that's maybe we'll lose some audience members or something. Let's and also, you know what? This is just history. This is just the real story. So it's just the birth of a nation. It's just ridiculous.
exactly, and this is actually part of a series of books that he wrote, a whole trilogy. The first one came out in 1902, which was called The Leopard's Spots, a romance of the white man's burden. So again, you can read
Oh
a lot of these
no!
titles tell you
Oh
exactly what you need to
man!
know. And it was actually like a direct response to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a book that was credited with helping turn popular opinion against slavery. It actually uses like the character names from that book, and just like Birth of a Nation eventually does, it glorifies the KKK. It villainizes the former slaves and the Reconstructionists. It's a complete handbook basically for this whole mythology of the lost cause,
And
and
this
he
is where
followed
this
that
movie
up.
comes from, and this is where Hollywood comes from. Therefore,
Yeah, we can't take them apart. Um,
horrible
it,
domino effect.
there's really so few aspects of American culture that aren't deeply entwined at some point with white supremacy, because that's just how our country is.
I'm already
And so,
starting to drink. I'm already
yeah,
starting.
go for it, go for it. I wish I had not been in a clear state of mind sitting through all 3+ hours of this movie, but that's what we're here for, so you don't have to. But anyways, he followed that up in 1905 with The Klansmen, a historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan. And it's basically what you end up seeing in the movie, that it talks about the war, but especially Reconstruction. And it has this villain that is the radical Republican Speaker of the House, that is overtly based on the real guy, Thaddeus Stevens, um, who Dixon hated. Pretty much all Southerners hated, because I mean, if you read about Stevens, he's a really fascinating guy, and he brooked no nonsense. He was very he advocated for complete equality for Black people and for the end of slavery, and he advocated for very extreme measures against the South after the war was lost. So you can debate about how wise it was as far as the extreme positions that he took after the war, as far as how the people of the South were treated, but he was the real deal as far as trying to get equity for former slaves and get them the vote, and get them recompense for basically being released out into the country with nothing.
Yeah,
So
this was one of the
obviously
most,
Dixon
I did
hated
not
him.
know about him at all. And if anything, and we'll get into this more once we get to the second act, the Reconstruction portion of the movie. But if anything, that's what I would point to, at least for like a ignorant white viewer like myself. I did not know a lot about Reconstruction and characters in history like Thaddeus, and just how much was going on as far as uh, Black politicians advocating already for like such, at the time, unfortunately viewed as radical ideas of equality and things like that. Um, when it's very easy, like for white kids growing up to be like, and then, after that, slavery was ended and things were on the right track. And, it was very simple. And Abraham Lincoln did it, right? And all that, if anything, this did remind me that there's a lot more for me to learn about all of that, how it worked and didn't work.
I really found that growing up in history classes personally through, grade school, middle school, and high school, they did really tend to just go straight from the end of slavery to the civil rights period. And yeah, there was
Yeah.
there was some segregation in between there. That's why we had to take care of that. And I didn't really get in depth into Reconstruction until I was in college. And I was shocked, really, when I learned all the details about it, because it was this relatively brief period of time where real strides were made with getting Black people to vote, getting representation in government, and there were, Black politicians. And, slowly but surely, the kind of the political winds started to change, and there was heavy resistance from the South. And so many reasons that we could do a whole series just talking about this. But it basically came down to caving, removing the northern troops or the federal troops from the South, and the southern states were basically free to go ahead and disenfranchise Black people again. It almost became unheard of that a Black person was holding elected office, and it's really just a tragedy of how there was so much progress in this short amount of time, and it all just completely unraveled. And what we're going to get here from someone like Dixon is, see, we told you, this was the whole reason, was that it was never going to work, and we had to come in and save the day. And to him, Reconstruction was just an attempt to make the whites the new slaves to the Blacks and to the Union. And this was a popular book, and he adapted it into a play, which was way more popular. Millions of people saw this play. And I guess that's where D.W. Griffith comes in, because he's the filmmaker who was just, like Dixon, he was born in the South. He was born in Kentucky. He was the son of a colonel in the Confederate Army. And he was very much like coming from the same place as he was. So it's, about a 10-year gap between 1905 when the Klansmen came out and then when it turned into the movie that we now know as The Birth of the Nation. And, time-wise, you could probably look at that as roughly like us doing a movie now about the Vietnam War. Like the kind of the end of the Vietnam War has been, I don't know, around the 50-year or so mark. And, of course, the Civil War lasted a lot shorter. And the Reconstruction period also is discussed in these. So that's a little fuzzy, but just for some context about how people would have been receiving this, as like a real-time history thing. And D.W. Griffith was really a pioneer in silent film. He helped popularize cross-cutting, which is such a basic thing now. We barely even notice it, where you're going back and forth between two different planes of action in different locations. That was inspired by Charles Dickens, actually, because his books would go back and forth chapter to chapter between different stories, updating you on what's going on. So he was making a Dickens adaptation and decided to replicate that. And that's just the beginning of everything he came up with.
Mm-hmm. And with Griffith, his filmography, even before this point, did Broken Blossoms come out before this?
I want to say after.
Okay, it was after. But it really points to this very classic him being seen as one of the first real deal like Hollywood directors, like paving the way for Hollywood's future. You can really see an inconsistency in his particular views and ways of communicating messages, because this obviously communicates what it communicates, like all sorts of negative things. And then there is a film called Broken Blossoms, which came out after by him, which is problematic in some ways, but also it is a mostly positively framed romance, interracial romance story. So, I was reading some things about D.W. Griffith, and they sort of saw him as this strange, and it's not to give him any sort of pass. He was a racist and misguided, but it was this sort of like, seemed like any sort of big idea that someone threw at him, any sort of like drama he could take and wield in a certain respect that would get a reaction from an audience, like something as intense as racism in the Civil War, or uh, regard or interracial couples or something like that in Broken Blossoms. You can see that there is a uh, sort of just like a business mindedness rather than an actual like moral judgment going on any of it, just weaponizing ideas.
Yeah, I do get a sense that he, at least compared to someone like Dixon, was less of an ideologue. He was more
Mm-hmm.
about making this cinematic experience, as opposed to Dixon, who dipped his toes into all kinds of different professions and everything, and was really about trying to communicate these ideas above any
Yes,
artistic pretensions.
which for me
And
really
Griffith,
speaks to like the danger that artists can fall into, I think, of being like, I wouldn't classify him as apolitical, but sometimes you can almost see um like the way he handles ideas as being like coming at it from an artist's perspective rather than actually thinking this through in a real world way, what this means, or like what this means in like politics or morality, which I think again is a dangerous place for artists and an easy place for them to get to because they spend so much time. I'm one of them. We sometimes spend so much time in our little fantasy worlds where ideas are just ideas, and fantasy is just fantasy, movies are just movies, books are just books, and we don't think about the ramifications of that, and it's very important.
that helps explain too why he was shocked at the reception that this movie got, or I should say, at the controversy that it caused. It totally caught him off guard. And he spent a good deal of his career afterwards, which did eventually kind of crater at some point, trying to apologize for it, to an extent. I know he made a very famous film that's another giant, even more expensive epic after this, called Intolerance, which a lot of people viewed as him trying to make up for the birth of a nation, going through different periods of history and showing oppression in different contexts. But he did also state that the movie was addressing people's intolerance towards the birth of a nation. So I'm not sure he ever totally got it. And he was
Yeah,
definitely coming from this place of privilege and growing up in the South and being surrounded by all this stuff where he just took it all for granted. He didn't even see it.
yeah, it's
Which
his
I
own
think a lot of
ego
people watching
defense.
at the time would have had the
It's
same thing.
Yeah, it's just him defending his art, not defending morality or admitting that he's doing anything wrong necessarily. It's about his art that someone is saying it about, which is it's the real thing. That's the problem, is that he's just seeing it all as dreams, not reality, and just living in sort of like a centrist sort of place. I watched a version of this where um, it's like the 3 hours and 24 minutes version where I think it's on Canopy that I watched it, and it features at the beginning of each part. The movie is split up into two parts, and each part begins with this. I think it was filmed in like the 30s or something. It's sound, but it's an interview with D.W. Griffith and some guy who is just sort of like just stroking his ego by the fireside and being like, it was like lightning when we saw this film. The things you've done, Mr. Griffith. How can we ever thank you?" And they're not saying much by the fireside. D.W. Griffith just sort of like takes the praise and builds his own self up, and really it all goes back to he's like just boasting about the Woodrow Wilson quotes and everything like that. It's kind of it's a really weird break in the action, that was added to the movie, and it only adds to the feeling that D.W. Griffith is sort of, I don't know, not thinking things through and just worried about his own ego, his own vision. Like there's just like the most boring, typical like artist response when like people like I think they barely touch on like the fact that there is controversy in the film's truth or something, and D.W. Griffith just gives some sort of like, strokes his chin and then says something about like blah blah blah, truth, 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 but what is truth? And then they fade out and the movie begins.
Yeah,
Which
he
is
just
just
wants to have
like,
his cake and eat it too.
might as well fast forward to our current moment where just everybody's fucking saying that, and we can't get anyone to live on the same planet with facts and truth and stuff. And
Right. They want to defend their art. They want to say that it should be taken seriously and that there was thought put into it. And whenever that breaks down, then the idea changes to, yeah, but it's just a movie. I had to take artistic license. Basically, I have no accountability for anything.
like, what is
And
life, man?
exactly.
Like,
This is Griffith in like a dorm room being like, yeah, but man, what is, is there really altruism? I mean, really? But anyways,
yeah,
so
exactly.
yeah, he's cited by many great filmmakers for his influence. He got this like special Oscar in the mid 30s, so he was still this celebrated figure throughout that. And you can't deny the technical virtuosity that he brings to the film. But then again, this history has now kind of shown that this is the movie he's going to be remembered for forever and ever. And it doesn't cast a kind shadow upon him. And that's what he gets.
Yes.
So maybe now we should go ahead and dive into the film itself.
Yes.
It's like you said, Seth, it's divided into two parts, and the first part roughly involves the beginning of the Civil War through Abraham Lincoln's assassination. And even though that there is a lot of the worst stuff kind of concentrated into the second part in Reconstruction, this first part is by no means free of those things. So it starts off with a little caption that's saying, "The bringing of the African to America planted the first seed of disunion," which is,
off to a bad
kind
start.
of a interesting, choice of words there, referring that to being, this is the seed for disunion, because we're going to argue over these Africans, is definitely a spin.
Yes, it almost vaguely feels like they're like blaming African Americans for this or something. They hadn't just complicated everything.
Exactly.
And isn't there another slide before this though, where that was added? At least in my version, there's another slide that's added something about like censorship boards or something like that. It's alluding to that, because it was so heavily censored in certain areas. There's like a slide that's like something about like, well, you can just sum up the slide and sort of just like, people shouldn't censor stuff. You shouldn't pick on my movie because, like, what if they censored the Bible and Shakespeare and stuff? Because my movie is as important as that.
Yeah, it's a very short blurb, so I think it's worth reading. The title card that Seth is referring to reads, "We do not fear censorship, for we have no wish to offend with improprieties or obscenities, but we do demand, as a right, the liberty to show the dark side of wrong, that we may illuminate the bright side of virtue, the same liberty that is conceded to the art of the written word, that art to which we owe the Bible and the works of Shakespeare."
Now, talk about missing the point, right? As far as why people were upset about this movie. Like, he's acting like the only controversy is that the Civil War sequences were too, bloody or disturbing.
This is like the last thing anybody gave a shit about.
And I think it goes one step further into insanity here by following that up with, if in this work we have conveyed to the mind the ravages of war to the end that war may be held in abhorrence, this effort will not have been in vain. So it like tries to position itself as like an anti-war film.
Absolutely. And that's what this movie does over and over again, is it just wants to say, no, all this really is against war, which is a fine sentiment, but the movie is not willing to accept that there is actually anything at stake in this war except the liberty of the South. It has nothing to do with slavery or them seceding from the nation. And this is just a peacenik movie that, man, doesn't war suck? And what an easy out to take for this. Like, we shouldn't have had the Civil War because war is hell, and that's as deep as its thinking goes.
But at the same time, it's totally taking like a triumphant, like the glory of war, and like, I mean, again, to the point that like the KKK's like atrocities and violence and like armies of KKK are like with being viewed as like a conquering, beautiful force or something like that. It's always trying to have its cake and eat it too. Again, centrist
Absolutely.
artists. It's a problem.
So, and now before we even get to the war part, pretty much right up front, we meet this invented character of Austin Stoneman, who's this parliamentary leader in the House of Representatives. And this is his facsimile of Thaddeus Stevens. So this is our villain from the North. He's scratching his bad wig, and he's always scheming and trying to just subjugate the South because he's just such a bad guy. And one of the worst parts is that he has this like mixed race servant who's presented as this scheming mastermind almost that he's enthralled to, which is really just commenting on what we've learned about the real Stevens having a relationship with somebody who was like a former housekeeper who was mixed race. And it's just trying to throw some shade on him for that. And make sure that he has kind of a co-villain here who represents Black people themselves. And, if you've seen the movie Lincoln by Steven Spielberg, the Tommy Lee Jones character is playing Thaddeus Stevens in that movie. And you see him like with his housekeeper in that. So those are kind of the two poles of his representation here on screen. But the movie takes it a step further and makes his family, the Stonemans, and his daughter, played by Lillian Gish, are kind of the representatives of the family in the North in Pennsylvania. And then in the South, we have the Camerons, which is another family, which is where all the stuff you were talking about, Seth. When we first see them, we see the slaves who are just happy in the cotton fields. Everyone is genteel and well-mannered. All of the Black people that we see are, they're the good ones. They know their place. They're happy where they are. They're suspicious of the North and Northern Black people. This is our Gone with the Wind territory, basically. This is the ideal that they're, trying to argue was irretrievably taken away from them. Yeah, and another weird thing is that we have white actors in blackface along with real Black actors in this movie.
Confusing.
Which is, yeah.
It almost seems like, I couldn't even track any sort of like rhyme or reason for it. Like if there was like, oh, well, there's the good ones and then there's the bad ones, but there's not even that. It's just really like haphazard.
As far as I could tell, Griffith had this attitude that none of the principal actors would be African American, and that no named characters, anybody of any consequence would
That's
be Black.
true.
They're all white actors in blackface. When you do see Black actors on the screen, they're generally extras or somebody with extremely minor role. And that was probably just the nature of Hollywood at the time. That was probably a logistical, matter that there was no working around. So it does seem like there was like a intentional effort made to use an all-white cast.
Yeah, and you're right that this would not be unusual at all for films made around that time. One of my favorite silent films by Buster Keaton, Seven Chances, a movie that I love, has a character who's in blackface, kind of playing this caricature of a black person. And when you watch movies from this time period, there are stuff like that that you have to adjust for. That is always going to be there. And to me, part of what matters is how integral is it to the plot. So, it's in bad taste and everything, but, Seven Chances isn't about how terrible black people are. It's unfortunate. Every time the character shows up, I cringe, but that is something that doesn't necessarily ruin the entire movie for me, as hard to watch as it is. And in this movie, this is a very different context because it has a very clear message about this. And part of me is almost grateful that we don't have to see real black actors forced to do the things, portray these villains in the
Yes.
way they do. That would have almost been more painful for me to watch.
Mm-hmm. Although their participation in this at all is painful to see. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, anytime that they are there, it's just insulting, and it brings this kind of level of reality from all of the play acting to show that
And you
these
have to
were
wonder
real
how
people.
much of the plot or what's actually going on in this movie was explained to them, like what even was communicated to them. Yeah, it's sad to witness.
For sure.
Um,
So
the war
yeah, we
starts.
do have the war breaks out, and we do get some scenes like where these black guerrilla soldiers are raiding and ransacking a town. But after that, it kind of takes a more general view of the war. Like, this looks like a war film that what seems familiar today. So
Yeah, this gets
I don't
into
know.
it
I
just
think that
feeling like a history lesson at this point,
yes,
which I don't know. There's like film convention aspects of this portion of the movie that are interesting, like academically. But I think for a lot of people, like they might not. I think the majority of the audience, if they didn't already turn it off at like the first scene of Blackface, they're going to turn it off like by the second battle or something, because they are just like they don't age well for like modern audiences at all. They do kind of feel like filmed uh, Civil War reenactments a lot of the time. I just personally found them pretty dull.
they do go on for a while, and there is a lot of taking a really, really wide view of the action. So, I could see that starting to get like repetitive. Although, I don't know, in old movies like this, I usually am to some extent blown away by the resources that they pour into it. You can tell that there's obviously hundreds of extras involved, just endless. Like it basically looks like they're restaging the actual Civil War at points, and with having
Mm-hmm.
to use like all of these weapons. And I do think that some of those sequences can be exciting just on the level of pure spectacle. And that's definitely something that would have been appealing to audiences at the time, because
Yes,
movies like this didn't typically use, hundreds of extras in this way, which are at times are made to look like there's actually thousands of them. And you can see that kind of carry through a lot of early Hollywood stuff. Like in the biblical epics, they would have so many resources and so many extras, and probably not great safety protocols.
no,
And yeah, that was one of the innovations of this movie, and it would have been extremely exciting to people at the time who had never seen anything like this on
for
such a
sure.
huge scale.
Especially at this
And
time when battle and war were still, I don't know, not seen the way they are now, which I don't know. There's still like a great part of the population back then. Not saying we don't have like bloodthirsty audiences now, but like a greater population back then would have probably seen this as like, this is exciting to see. This is like watching a sporting event, This is men being
mhm,
men. This is good stuff. Even though it does, I mean, the best parts for me and the most like revolutionary parts, I think, of those portions are where they zoom in, and we see like little dramas going on in the action, which of course is revolutionary because of the fact that that can't happen in a play in the same way, right? This like huge action sequence, and we get to suddenly go from like watching the whole thing happening to zooming in on just like two soldiers, and they, you know, like a little drama that goes on between the two soldiers, a little tragedy that occurs. Like little things like that are really, really shine.
Absolutely. And just the use of close ups itself was not a common thing back then. So, just the way that this movie cuts between wide shots and close ups and establishing shots, and like you said, focusing in on these little things, these little dramas, which does kind of recreate how the human eye might scan something, you know, taking it in a big general way and then focusing kind of randomly on little things. And it is very exciting. And there's also the way this movie uses fade outs, you know, things that fading into black, you know, between the little different sections, the way that it tints some of the color tinting in different scenes, so that sometimes like at night, everything has this kind of like red glow to it. And that also plays into the whole, you know, intercutting between action in different locations, which really gets stepped up, I think, on the second half of this movie, when we have like multiple different chases and rescues going on at the same time.
Now
And
we
that's
may
kind of
delete we may delete this, but this is something I'm always thinking about, and I think it's just something that maybe a lot of other people don't know. The color tinting, monochroming, and things like that. If I went and saw this during the original release, that wasn't going on, correct? This is maybe a stupid question.
Can you check on that, Tony? Because I thought that it was, but
I believe it was.
Because I've always
and,
wondered that about like silent films in general. Because I'm always like, okay, yes, like there's like suddenly a red filter on when we show all the dead soldiers at the end of the battle. But I don't know. Yeah, I've always wondered if that was like a post, like after release, like digital thing or what. Like,
no. It was definitely a part of the original releases. I don't necessarily know if like, again, because there were so many versions of this floating around, I don't know if like what audiences would have seen most commonly at the time. But so there's a technique used by this company, and I'm obviously looking this up on the fly. I do have it handy here, but Kinemacolor was some kind of like processing that would apply that like tinting, and I think it was mostly not used in that way. I think it was mostly like what we think of the older like pre-color films having, you know, like the like painted looking film reels, right? So I don't know a lot about how it worked technically, but this movie, like whatever Kinemacolor was, required some special kind of like projector to display, and a lot of theaters would not buy it. And so there was some kind of like issue with the producers of this film where they were going to show this in Kinemacolor, but it wasn't going to allow them to release it as widely as they wanted to, and so they bailed on it. And Kinemacolor, whatever the company behind that was, sued the producers, and so they did get some kind of a settlement where anytime this was shown, I don't know if they got some kind of royalty or what. Probably too in the weeds on the legal stuff here, but yeah. So I think this was like envisioned that way from the start, and probably always would have been shown with the tinting that Marc's talking about.
I've always wondered this. Yeah, I've always wondered if this was some sort of like in the 50s thing that they went back and did to like spice up silent movies or something. Okay. I don't know. I've always wondered about that. So that does really, I mean, that is really effective in this movie when it does choose to show like scenes in nature in green, or like war scenes in red or scenes of triumph with like a sepia tone. I do think it's very intentional, like obviously very intentional. And I wonder how intentionally it was used before this movie.
Yeah, I had to kind of ramble through pulling these strings together, but here's the definitive answer to the question. When the film was first released in 1915, it did contain this original tinting. Subsequent versions, especially in like the home video age, lost that. Some of them were just in pure black and white. And then the first time that tinting was ever restored was on the Blu-ray release, which would have not been too long ago at this point. Actually, exactly on the centenary. So 2015 was the first time contemporary, 2015 was the first time modern audiences would have seen the color tinting after decades of seeing this in black and white. But when it was released in 1915, the tinting was all there as we see it today.
Fascinating aside.
All right. Yeah. And so, yeah, there's a lot of really spectacular looking just shots in this movie. Visually, it can be very beautiful. And even in some shots where it's like a very wide shot of, Klansmen riding through the sunset, you have to remind yourself what you're actually looking at because it's filmed in such an impactful way. And the score was another big thing with this movie, that it had an entire orchestral score that was made specifically for the movie. It uses little motifs from other songs. It uses original compositions. It has these little leitmotifs that will play repeatedly when certain characters show up. That was all innovative for the time too.
Which it wasn't like live soundtracking, was it at all? I don't think that occurred with the traveling thing, because did we touch on that? Because that was like another aspect that like he toured around with the movie, right? Like from like it was a circus or something.
Yeah, a road show, and a lot of movies were released that way at the time. And it would be a big event, when it came into your town, because movies weren't something that you could always see, all the time. So that, the landscape has changed so much since then. It's easy to forget all of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a big part of this movie as a whole. Watching it today, all these things that we've been talking about would kind of go over people's heads today because we've seen this thousands and thousands and thousands of times since.
Mm-hmm.
And to people at the time, they would have just been gobsmacked by it. And a lot of the racial stuff would not seem as incendiary as it does now. So you really have to adjust to appreciate a lot of those things to see how they work, because we don't think about cutting between close-ups and wide shots now. Our mind just accepts it.
I heard it was really expensive to see it too when it came out. Like I read something like at a certain point it was like $50 to go see it. Like in our money now, like it would be like going to see a $50 movie, which is just like
Well, that makes sense because they couldn't stay home and watch TV.
Yes.
There
there
were no
like
alternatives.
the equivalent of like some new like virtual reality movie coming out right now that you would spend like $50 to like get plugged into, and like that's like at the level of where this movie was.
Yeah, and just the way that everyone was actually getting to see all of these historical events being reenacted in this way for the first time. So we get, we see Abraham Lincoln in this. We see the Appomattox Courthouse surrender, and we see Lincoln's assassination, all staged, at least ostensibly, to be as accurate as possible. And I want to talk about how this movie treats Abraham Lincoln, because it has a very specific perspective on him, that he's portrayed as someone who was basically strong-armed into this war. And once it's over, he's the only one who wants to grant clemency to the South and help them rebuild. There's a scene where he pardons the last remaining son from this Southern family from being hung. And it makes me wonder if that's just because Lincoln was such a popular figure at the time that they didn't want to smear him, even though he was the leader of the North during the war. And again, they still want to romanticize him.
Kind of Frankenstein's monster of a perspective on how things went down. Of like, you think you would hate the leader of the Union, this president who uh, helped to free the slaves with his legislation and things like that, who you apparently like wish were still below you and believe are should inherently be below you and forced to be below you by your Ku Klux Klan army and stuff. But here he is like still seen as like this beautiful grandpa, which is just, I mean, continues to this day to be like this weird sort of, you can see it in like the inconsistencies in a lot of like older generations and our and just conservative ideas about history and things like that, like having a reverence for certain figures even though your politics do not measure up or like sync up.
Yeah, and this movie just fits him into its own narrative as needed. But I do want to say that I think his assassination scene might be the best one in the whole movie, because if you could just airlift it out of this movie and it doesn't have all of the other troubling stuff and the lies and the
Mm-hmm.
propaganda aspect, and it's just a really like suspenseful, well staged, exciting, scary sequence.
The only thing I would say about it, and this might be kind of reaching, this might just be me, but there is like, I couldn't help but think about um, just John Wilkes Booth in general, and that being like him being featured in this movie, his like crazy act of like like intense violence that would shock the nation and everything, like we've sort of grown unfortunately accustomed to uh like lone gunmen, shooters, all sorts of horrible like hate crimes and things like that that are quite often now understood um to be, they know now that if I go out and shoot up a movie theater, the world will know and my story will be told and I will be seen and things like that. And this is an instance, like an early instance of seeing and framing this, whether it's on purpose or not. Like we are now witnessing the drama, the excitement, the drama of an assassination of a lone gunman who kills Abraham Lincoln and theatrically like falls down on the stage. We have the added like irony of him
Mhm.
being like, wasn't he like a failed actor or something like that? And now he's on the stage. He gets to proclaim his like little statement, which is of course hearsay. We have no idea, and probably no one heard anything over the screams of horror after Abraham Lincoln was shot, right? Like I think it's like probably hearsay that we actually like heard him say like death to tyranny or whatever it was, and then he runs off dramatically off stage like he's had his big actor moment, like his moment in the spotlight. I don't know, I just thought that was an interesting like sort of weird prologue to horrible things to come, which of course it was, in a way, in its own way, and it being
Well, there is a
framed in a
fascination
film.
to that, to
Mm-hmm.
things that happen like that, and seeing it recreated is a very, sensational thing. And you're
Which
right,
film
this
would
is,
continue to go on to
yeah,
do, to like
for
frame
sure.
violence and death and killing to be a thing that could be attractive, could be exciting, could be. And again, I'm not saying that like D.W. Griffith is doing that on purpose. Like it seems like he specifically likes Lincoln and doesn't want him to be assassinated. I just thought that was an interesting instance in film history as far as that is concerned.
And you could talk about filming battles having the same effect, that it's
Mm-hmm.
hard to show war without making it seem exciting. And people have definitely, I think, risen to that challenge at certain times, whether it's like the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, or where they're showing things to be chaotic and scary as opposed to thrilling. And this movie does have, the two boys from the North and South who were friends in scenes earlier, encountering each other and dying together on the battlefield. Which again, just taking that alone is a powerful thing. It's a melodramatic thing. But
yeah,
I think it is still pretty effective, and that anything positive that this movie is remembered for is generally from the actual battles of the Civil War and maybe Lincoln's assassination. But that's all in part one. We should probably dive into part two now, which is exclusively about this fantasy version of Reconstruction.
but first take a 10-minute intermission. Close your eyes right now and just let's do this. No, we're not going to do that. We're just going to
no, but we're going to get through this
skipping
together.
the intermission. I have nothing to say about the intermission. It was just all a black screen. Nothing to say about
the
it.
intermission was the least fraught part of this whole movie.
Yeah, it was welcome because I could justify myself skipping that part, which
Right. So yeah, part two is
not that I couldn't justify myself skipping a lot of this. Yes, that's the whole thing. But anyway, part two. Yep. Go hit it, Marc.
So yeah, again, part one, absolutely not free of distortions and racist attitudes and agendas. And part two, though, is really where it just explodes into the forefront. We meet this Silas Lynch character, who is another mixed race character who joins the carpetbaggers from the North to wield the Negro vote and induce them to lead work.
The wiki page describes him as a psychotic mulatto.
Yeah, they use the term mulatto
in quotation marks. In quotation marks.
Maybe before we get too deep into the part two of this movie, we should, for those who maybe don't know, get a couple of definitions out of the way for some really commonly used terms in this movie. None of these words, which have fortunately survived into modernity and you should never ever say, but mulatto certainly is one of them you see all the time, just used to generally describe any person, I think, of like mixed European and African descent. One you see over and over and over is carpetbagger, which is used to refer to basically a scheming northerner coming into the South for malicious reasons, either in politics to impose the Reconstruction agenda, or maybe in business to come take advantage of the chaotic Southern economy. And then that is contrasted with the scalawag, which would be
scalawags.
Yeah, a Southerner, a native Southerner who is sympathetic to the Northern / Reconstructionist cause.
Traitors all.
Traitors all. I think that's about all of them.
Thank you, Tony. Very good idea.
Yeah. I wish that you wouldn't put those definitions in every episode we've recorded so far, but finally they have relevance. So thank you for...
I know. I didn't know why you were talking about that in Sallow, but...
I knew this day would come.
Yeah.
We'll keep doing it just in case.
So yeah, this second part of the movie, after, we see this, again, fantasy of the Northerners coming down and it's election day and they're turning away the whites and black people are coming through and just being told who to vote for. Someone votes twice. And there's this, I think, it's hard to pick a worst sequence in this movie, but the one that's always stuck with me is this scene in the State House where they have a bunch of black representatives who were voted in during this scheme of an election day. And it's just presented like this farce, like the animals have taken over the zoo and they have their bare feet up on the table, they're drinking. They pass interracial marriage, which according to this movie means just forced. They can just take anyone they want to.
Oh yeah, it's accompanied by seeing people in blackface like eyeing white women and stuff like that. Again, giving so much. I don't know, giving it a real depiction of this white myth fear that like they're gonna, now that we've given them freedom, they're gonna take our precious white women, and stuff like that. It's a horrible, horrible scene where, yeah, it's again like this communication to the audience that I see, like, if these people are not meant to have power in any sort of way, they can't handle it. They just they're just going to ruin politics. They're going to ruin society, and they're going to ruin our precious white women. And it's extremely depressing that there were, and there were audiences that watched this and nodded their heads yes.
And especially in just knowing the history of how so many lynchings were justified by accusations, false accusations of black men sexually assaulting white women, of just, casting them the wrong kind of a look. And we see this movie act that out like it's a plague. And this movie is deeply, deeply fearful of black men scheming after white women. And we see it again and again, from one character chasing the little sister from this Southern family around until she jumps off a cliff to her death. And then, of
That was
course,
maybe like one of the hardest scenes for me to watch because it was just so like you're not. He seems like a monster. He's no longer seems like like even a depiction of an African American at this point. He seems like he's a horrible monster in this scene, and there's just such hate on display, such extreme hate that I have never seen depicted in this brash, like unapologetic way. That it was one of the most disturbing things I've seen is just the way that this scene and various scenes depict these people as monsters, and in a way that is supposed to, for me feels like it's supposed to get white audiences riled up, and even and beyond just like it being like an insulting picture, it feels like this whole second half of the movie is like supposed to get white audiences riled up and go out and like be suspicious of your black neighbors and go out and burn the houses and get into fights and don't let them touch your daughters and things like that. And this movie is absolutely responsible for that in big ways. And I can't point to another movie that you can really say that about, that really caused actual violence directly. Like I read, I mean, I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but it's hard not to get fired up a little bit about this movie. But I've read one of the things is, and I might be wrong, but the burning cross, the first instance of a burning cross is in this movie.
At least the Latin cross being burned, which became this big symbol. And should talk about, I mean, we've only talked a little bit about the Ku Klux Klan so far, but
coming up,
this is like, this is an origin story for the KKK, and they are the heroes of this story. They're a group of Batmans taking vigilante justice and saving the day, specifically to save these white women. They capture the guy who was chasing her around and give him their little trial, which is just a lynching. And you can see right there the whole blueprint for justifying this scourge of lynchings that were so common in the South, that you can absolutely see that there.
And the origin story is told in this really horrible, stupid way where the dad character is like, just goes away, just like can't believe like where his beautiful Southern utopia has gone. And he's just despondent in the woods, and he sees these, quote unquote, evil black children chasing white children around because, they're always doing that. And the kids hide, the white kids hide underneath a white sheet, and the black kids wait, and then all of a sudden the white kids stir under it, and the black kids run away because they think it's a ghost, and that's his aha moment. Horrible. just horrible to witness it as this sort of like, and again, it feels like it's framed, and like I think Batman is actually pretty apt, unfortunately, especially if we're talking about like it feels
Yeah,
like
it's like
a
like him
superhero
falling in
movie
the cave
origin.
and the bats come flying out.
It's like, all right, here we go, and I mean, this it does show that audience members can really get behind masked justice, can get really riled up about it. I read that there was like a bit of a rash of like films adopting similar like costumes, even if it was like there was a movie I read about called The Mormon Maid that after this came out, it depicted like some Mormon revenge scene that like where they dress up sort of like the Ku Klux Klan or something like that. It was this sort of like not necessarily the fact that they were the Ku Klux Klan. It was like this like masked vigilante justice like that excited the audience so much of like, yeah, like we could call upon, which of course was like the basis for the Ku Klux Klan, which was this sort of like anonymous, like holy justice from the heavens that comes down as faceless, you know.
And this movie, it is credited with directly inspiring the resuscitation of the Ku Klux Klan. And that's no joke. You can absolutely see how this would be a rallying cry for that. And that's a real, world consequence that this had. And, Dixon and Griffith and Woodrow Wilson would try to distance themselves from that as time would go on. But there's really no other way to interpret this movie. And that's, that might be its most lasting legacy, ultimately.
Yes. And it should be, because it's its gravest sin.
And so the rest of the movie basically is this kind of extended climax where we have the Southern family is barricaded in a little cabin with the Black Army is trying to break in and get to them, while the Klan is racing to the rescue, while at the same time Lillian Gish character is about to be forcibly married to this Silas Lynch character. And again, we have Stoneman, aka Thaddeus Stevens, back in the South, scheming and planning. And when Lynch tells him that he wants to marry a white woman, he's like, "Oh yeah, great." Then he finds out that it's his own daughter and is portrayed as this hypocrite then that won't have it when it's happening to his own daughter.
Once
So
again,
just
supposed
more
to teach the audience that, like,
exactly.
Okay, you may think it's an okay idea until it's your daughter, this like horrible thing.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's all framed as
And
this like white Ragnarok or something. Like it's insane the way it's all framed. It's like not the idea that it's like the end of the world for the white race or something at the end of this movie. That that there's literally a frame of this where there's a slide that says like, and the something about the white minority cowers in the shadows or something like that.
I have this
Which is just,
quote.
yes.
It's the former enemies of North and South are united again in common defense of their Aryan birthright.
That one too.
And that's something that could be used in, Nazi Germany years later. That's exactly the kind of point of view.
Or again, this idea of whites being trampled underfoot, the idea that they will not be the majority. Like, obviously, fast forward to now, it's amazing. We're still dealing with that sort of rhetoric and narrative that extreme right Republican nationalist white people are constantly drumming that up, that minorities and non-Christians are trying to are like have already, not that it's happening, but have already like replaced them in some sort of way, that they are not the that there's some sort of martyrdom to being white and Christian and middle class or something like going on, which is just absurd. That and this is like this um, filmic version of a nightmare that they have, which is the idea of all these foreigners, all these black people, like an army of them attacking like this last bastion of white family ness in this little cabin in a field somewhere as they cower and stuff, which is just like it's insane when you see it as like depicted, but it is really the end result of how like a lot of people unfortunately still think and are like still like believing that things could head in this direction. Like it's horrible.
And that goes back to the power of film as being used for propaganda, because those later scenes are so charged and visceral, and you have the intercutting, you have multiple shots of the Klan trying to get there in time to save them. And I kept finding myself experiencing this really intense cognitive dissonance watching all this, right? Because, I see a Ku Klux Klan uh, member riding and chasing a black person in a movie now, and automatically I'm like, oh my God, the bad guy is going for the good guy and stirring up all of these emotions. And in this movie, you'll see that. And then all the cinematic cues are telling you, no, these are the good guys coming to save the day. These are your heroes who are trapped. And it was like every minute I had to remind myself, oh, wait, this movie is telling me that these are actually the good guys. And shutting off my brain just made all of this confusion that you're just not used to seeing something like that. And I kept just getting instinctually confused about like, oh, wait, no. I thought I was seeing a bad thing, but this is supposed to be a good thing. And that just shows how deeply ingrained, our conditioning is.
It's a testament that there is a danger to content. Uh, and it's, I mean, it's a whole discussion in itself. There's always arguments against the idea that like because there's violence in movies or something like that, it's like I don't want to equate it to that. Like it's very complicated. Like because there's a lot of people that believe like, oh, because your kids see gun violence in a movie, that they grow up to go off and shoot people. Um, I I don't necessarily believe that in certain contexts, but in other contexts, in the right contexts, in contexts like this, where there is actual weaponized intent behind depictions of racism and racial violence and stirring up an audience to feel a certain way, I think there is real danger, and we should not like just write that off. And that's why it's very, very important to see all art with a critical eye, um, and understand that it can influence people. It can even on a subconscious level or something like that. These messages got out there. This reinvigorated the KKK. This helped a lot of people justify a lot of bullshit in their life, I think. And it's just because this stupid movie. So we need to be careful. As much as I want to be careful to defend the idea that we shouldn't be like censoring a lot of things, but it's a real tricky place. It's dangerous. It can be dangerous.
Exactly, because there is no easy line that you can constantly draw. When a movie as stupid as Joker came out a few years ago, there were all these reports that this is going to lead to riots and violence all over the country from disgruntled white people. which did not happen.
The incel rebellion. Yeah, the media was
Yes.
so concerned about.
Well, at the same time, you have a movie like this where its aims are so clear and at such a crucial, sensitive point in history where there were not protections against this actually being realized, that you have to take that critical eye to whatever the specific thing is. You have to consider the context. You have to consider the intent behind it and who the audience is. And there's not a super easy black and white answer that you can just stamp on to anything. And so in one sense, The Birth of a Nation, it makes it black and white in that it's so clear what it's doing, and it might make it easier to excuse other movies that are more insidious and suggestive about it, since this one just wears it right out on the surface. But then again, there's also a value in seeing how this brings up to the surface what all those other movies may just be subtly implying, but trying to hedge their bets and pull their punches. So in that way, it's kind of like this is really revealing, but you also don't want to fall into the trap of being like, well, if a movie isn't this upfront about it, then there's nothing wrong. But anyways, we get to the end of this movie. The Klan saves the day. They guard the next election, which you can't see in any other way than the real historical like voter intimidation and disenfranchisement. But of course, in this movie, it's the heroic solution that they disarm the black people, they guard the election, and then we have this bizarre shot of like Jesus among the people at the end.
Oh my God! Oh,
right.
Well, mine had a vision of hell. Did yours have a vision of hell?
It was something like that, like some giant guy on a horse and people like dead all around him. And then
well, because
I guess that's like, supposed to be war.
From, like dialogue sequence where like what's his face who started the KKK is getting married, and they're like talking about like, just think of how heaven will be or something, basically, like. And then they cut to hell first, which is really confusing. Yeah, it seems like it's hell. And there's like a giant guy on a horse, and he's like punishing all these people. It looks like that movie Haxan. And then they cut to heaven. And then it's all just like people dancing, and it's nice. And there's a blue filter on it. And Jesus is there.
White Jesus, of course.
Oh, white as hell. Aryan Jesus.
Yeah, which is... just a cheesy way to end, regardless of all of the implications to it.
Yeah, as really if we didn't need something. I mean, it's again like pointing to just like D.W. Griffith just trying to please a certain kind of American audience member at this point. It feels like just like those grandpas who are real excited about the Civil War are probably also going to be like, and I heard you like Jesus too. I got Jesus in this movie. There it is at the end. Just rounded my bases.
Yeah, it's all just a part of this being a giant act of self-justification for the way that they want to view the world and the way that they have been behaving. And I definitely don't want to end a discussion of this without talking about Woodrow Wilson, because he was president when this movie came out. He was also a Southern guy. He was the first Southerner who was elected president since like 1848. And he did know Thomas Dixon. He had the screening at the White House, and he has this very famous quote about the movie that is usually the first thing to come up when this movie is discussed, which may be apocryphal. People seem to be arguing about it, but reportedly he said of the movie that it is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is also terribly true. Now, he tried to walk that back in later years once he saw how controversial the film was getting.
I did say terribly, you know.
Right. Lightning can be bad.
Woodrow Wilson, real piece of shit. Enemy of this podcast for sure.
Yeah, he's never allowed on.
Yeah, ever since he said the same thing about Freddie Got Fingered, he lost all credibility.
Yeah,
I think it's hard. It's hard to rank the presidents in terms of how racist they are, because they're just all so high up there. But Wilson, for being kind of seen as a potential savior of Black Southerners during his campaign, and then pretty much immediately betraying them and further segregating the federal government, the military. This guy probably goes down as being one of the most most racist. Open question, but like at a time where implementing these racist policies was going to be as devastating as possible. This guy is an all-timer, and the fact that this was just shown in the White House, to whatever degree that even matters for this movie's legacy and all of the actual real world violence it did unleash that we've discussed. What a like darkly poetic, just kind of punctuation mark on this guy's whole shitty tenure as president.
But that's another thing where it's hard to separate these things, because he did advance like a lot of really progressive agendas while he was, domestically, while he was in office. He created the income tax, the Federal Reserve, a lot of like antitrust laws. So in one sense, he was seen as one of the most progressive presidents of the time. But then, like you said, Tony, he instituted segregation in like the federal bureaucracy and really advanced racial discrimination. And he was definitely an apologist for slavery and the lost cause and all that stuff that Griffith and Dixon would have been familiar with. So it's just like kind of trying to parse this movie for all of the other things that it does that you can't separate from the everything else that it influenced in a negative way.
Yep.
He's a good match for this movie in that way.
Yeah.
And like all these guys,
be that guy.
Yeah, just that all these guys knew each other. They all grew up during this period that this film kind of like romanticizes. It is hard to think of something else like this in modern history, for sure.
So I do want to get to some kind of closing thoughts here, because this is Unwatchables, and I want to address our actual experience of us today in 2022 watching this. I think we can all agree it's a pretty exhausting experience for the length and the content. But I want to start here with a little passage from a review that Roger Ebert wrote about this movie. And I think it's very thoughtful and something that if anyone's interested in this movie, that you should go ahead and read Roger Ebert's great movie review of this. And I want to just take out one particular paragraph here that I think maybe could prompt us into talking about our own thoughts. So this is from Ebert's review. He said, "To understand the birth of a nation, we must first understand the difference between what we bring to the film and what the film brings to us. All serious moviegoers must sooner or later arrive at a point where they see a film for what it is and not simply for what they feel about it. The Birth of a Nation is not a bad film because it argues for evil. Like Riefenstahl's The Triumph of the Will, it is a great film that argues for evil. To understand how it does so is to learn a great deal about film and even something about evil." So my takeaway from that is that I agree with his last line there, that we can understand a lot about film and about evil and where the two things intersect from this movie. But I'm not so sure I agree with the idea that a movie can just be objectively great outside of our reaction to it. There's lots of great films that I don't think are great, and that does come from a personal reaction, but how can you really separate the two? So I'm not really one to say, oh yeah, this is a great movie, just not for me. I would like to think that there's some sort of intersection there where if your taste is informed enough, that your reaction really does count. And while there's things in this movie that really do work on a certain level, that is it made me feel terrible, and I found it to be repugnant and vile, and I'm not sure that anything else can really overcome that to say, but it is still a great film.
Ebert's review really rings of, I think, a fault in a lot of criticism and a lot of belief about art, that it is like at a certain level, like, I don't know, that it's so very important, like, for us to experience it, for it to be there, even regardless of what the real world implications are, which I just don't agree with that at all. I see it as like, I don't care how good something is or how great it is in the canon.
Mm-hmm.
If it is at this level of irresponsibility, it is not great to me anymore. And it is not worthwhile to me anymore. And I think that's important to distinguish, that like, art is only so important. It is only so important in the face of morality and real world implications and the safety of real life human beings. This is all still, for better or worse, kind of, it's still just play. It's still just something that is a little first world. It's a little frivolous, at like, in the face of something as horrible as instigating racial violence with a silly fucking movie, which makes me hate this movie, makes me think that there is no need to spend time typing out the words "great movie" as a caveat for it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that when I first saw this movie like 10 years ago or so, I did buy a little bit into, we can't ignore this because it has done great things for art and we need to grapple with it. And at this point, I definitely agree with the second part of that, but I don't think that what am I trying to say here? I don't think that that is as an important part of the equation, and that it's okay to come out and say I hate this movie, and not to kind of chicken out and say, well, you can't really rate a movie like this, let's just study it. I think it's safe to come out and say that I'm glad that I examined it and that I'm more knowledgeable about it, but I would absolutely love to unwatch it.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the great argument that a lot of people have for this movie, which is all of the technical advancements that it has, like the classic, like, yes, it's awful, but like, think of all the new things we got from this. Like, well, I have too much faith in humanity and artists that if it wasn't D.W. Griffith with this like awful vision, we could have still figured it out. We still could have figured out a lot of these film conventions. It would still happen. Um, and there's we didn't require this movie. Like, that's the big thing. Like, we
If
did
Thomas
not.
Edison had never been born, we wouldn't in 2022 still be sitting around in the dark.
Yes. Yeah.
Well said.
And that's a
So
real,
hopefully
yeah,
this was
that's
a
an important
discussion
perspective to
that's
have.
Mhm. So hopefully this was a discussion that was worthwhile for anybody listening, especially if you were interested in the movie and don't actually want to sit through it. And if you do, go ahead, but maybe just do it alone at home and watch it for free somewhere, for educational purposes. But that is
Yeah.
totally up to you. I don't think
That's all I
anyone
could
needs to see
say.
this movie.
That's all I could say from my viewing. I do think anything I got from this was just reminding me that I'm not doing enough work in like my own life to know more about uh, the atrocities that happen, and Reconstructionism and the Civil War, and like how things actually happened. Really, that's all it served as. So really, that's not a positive for this movie. It is just for a white audience. Maybe you will just be reminded of like more things you need to learn about, but again, not worth the sit as far as that is concerned. We should just be more vigilant and be reading about these things.
All right. And so, Tony, why is this your favorite movie of all time?
Yeah.
Well, Mark,
why did
I'm
you
glad
laugh
you asked.
the whole time?
And that's a good segue into part 2 of our exploration of this.
Unwatchables is produced by Tony Scarpitti, hosted by me, Marc Dottavio, and Seth Troyer, with artwork by Micah Kraus. You can find Seth and I on Letterboxd under Marc Dottavio and Sloth Troyer. You can also check us out at unwatchablespod.com for links to our Twitter and Instagram, or support us on Patreon for bonus content and to have a say in what we watch. Thanks for listening.